might just again wait until the panel comes down.
Okay, you're live. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Hello and welcome to this afternoon's event, which is part of Book Week Scotland, a national annual celebration of all things reading and writing. Thank you so much for bearing with us while we had a slight technical snafu there, but I think, and I hope everything is good and you're hearing and seeing us all now. My name's Heather Parry, and I am thrilled to be in conversation today with a man whose work has had an enormous impact on me over the years. Alan Moore is widely regarded as the best and most influential writer in the history of comics. His seminal works include From Hell, Lost Girls, and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He's also the author of the best-selling novel Jerusalem, and most recently, Illuminations, which I have right here, a collection of short-ish fiction, I think that's the best way to put it, spanning 40 years. Alan, welcome, and of course, happy birthday.
Well, it's great to be here, Heather. It's lovely to be talking to you. And my birthday was actually yesterday. So I'm now, I know I don't look a day over 70, but I actually am. Yeah, well, thank you. And yeah, it's lovely to be here talking to everybody.
Are you a person that feels a move into a new decade, or do you feel just the same person?
I still feel like the same person. No, I don't really feel moves to new decades. I suppose when in the year 2000, I suppose I felt that felt a bit significant. Because we'd had a very, very memorable party down at the farm that I'd got in Wales, which was lovely. Everybody was there, and so yeah, the next morning it did feel significant, and I think I gave up drink as my new millennium resolution. Yeah, that felt different. But the other ones, it's just a kind of the vague drift of your life. You still are pretty much the same person that you were 6 months ago. There's slight differences, but I don't really feel it.
I love to have a party that's so good that you give up drink after it. I feel like that's the party to end all parties.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
I kind of want to start with just asking how this book came to be, because obviously you've had a very, very long and brilliant career, but this is your first short story collection. So why this book and why now?
Well, a few years ago, this would have probably been sometime during 2019, 2020. I found myself thinking about taking my first ever contracted book deal, which somehow, by working in the comics industry, I'd managed to get through nearly 40 years without ever having been offered. So I was putting in a pitch to Bloomsbury for 6 books, and I wanted the first one to be a collection of short stories because I'd already got some of them written, and therefore it would be quicker and easier. But that did leave me with about 4 short stories to write to fill the book out, which was kind of great because I hadn't actually written any short stories for ages. And so that was how the Thunderman story happened, which it kind of is. Yeah, I know it's novel length, but I insist that it is kind of a short story because that was the mindset that I started it in. It was just a short story that wouldn't end. And so sort of, but you know, you've got a different head on when you're working on a novel because it's a novel and that's a big weighty thing, and you're probably going to be really obsessing over it and trying to make it as good as possible. and you kind of stiffen up a little bit. But starting that as a short story and then just carrying on because I was enjoying it, that gave it a completely different feel. So no, I really, really loved finishing the stories in the Illuminations. They sort of gave me a chance, because it probably won't be, it'll probably be quite a long while before I get around to doing any short stories again with this big string of novels to write. So I wanted to get all of the best short story licks that I could think of out of my system before sort of getting down to writing them.
Maybe we can talk about the new string of novels a little bit later, but I wanted to ask how it was to go back to work. So the first story in the collection is, I have to tell you, Alan, almost as old as me. I think you published it when I was a year old. And how
would be, yeah.
How does it feel to go back to work that maybe was written by like a very different you in a very different time?
Well, in the case of that particular story, the hypothetical lizard, when I look back at it, I thought, actually, this is pretty good. You know, I found it was probably the first short story that I'd ever written. And I looked at it and I thought, yeah, this stands up. The only thing that we had to change was that back then I'd got a biologically male character capitalized as she or her, because sort of the idea of people being transgendered really wasn't being talked about much at that time. So I thought to draw attention to it. But of course, in the 21st century, we dropped all the capitals, and it seemed to read to me like a fairly modern piece of work. You know, it was interesting to have that chronological stretch of different writings. It was like one of my daughters for my birthday. She did this gigantic, beautiful or horrific card, depending upon how you look at it, where it's just a collage of pictures of my face in my many guises. Probably as many as David Bowie over the years, I should think, you know, although I don't look anywhere near as good in a jumpsuit. But sort of, but yeah, it was nice to have a string of stories where I could actually see, because when you read a story of your own after a period of decades or years or whatever, it does take you straight back to the mindset that you were in when you wrote it. You can remember why you made those word choices and things like that. And so it was really nice because, yes, as you say, I was a very different person. Well, a slightly different person, probably. I was a younger person. But then you can see the way that your priorities change. Probably back then I was just thinking, yeah, if I can just dazzle everybody with the language enough, then they'll probably think it's a good story when they've finished it, even if the rest of it hasn't maybe worked as well as I wanted to. But and then I can see in the later stories you get a growing in confidence, you know, and I've always loved short stories. They're the best place for any writer to start their career, because you have to solve all the problems of a long work in a few pages. You know, it's just the most brilliant apprenticeship that you can do.
And I think you can see that you are kind of growing in confidence as you get later and later as well, because you start kind of like playing with form a lot more. And what I love, I've listened to so many interviews of you talking about process and work and form and stuff. And I always just really appreciate you saying, like, you write comics to be showing off what comics can do the best. And you can see that this is true of the short stories as well, especially in American Light, which is playing so much with the footnotes,
Yeah.
but also kind of using like the rhythm of beat poetry to like satirize, I think, beat poetry as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Thank you for asking, because that's one of the stories that has received very little mention in any of the reviews, I suspect, because of all the footnotes. I mean, I suppose I might have got the footnotes from. I remember a few years ago, I had a big period where I just read everything by David Foster Wallace. I read all the way through Infinite Jest with loads of footnotes, which you have to look up at the back, or you won't get the novel. And it's really tedious and it's really annoying. And I got to footnote 275 or something, and somebody had used a phrase in a sentence which wasn't immediately clear, and there was 275 at the end. So I leafed through to the back of the book, and footnote 275 was haven't a clue. At which point I thought, oh, you're doing this to torment me and make me angry, aren't you? I kind of appreciate that. But when I came to do American Light, it was partly because I just worked out how to do footnotes on my computer. And I thought, what kind of thing would be a good vehicle for that? I quite fancy doing something where you've got one narrative and then another narrative that is commenting upon it. And so, yeah, I was able to sort of get all of my beat poetry licks out of my system in the main poem. But that was a bit strange, because at the end of it, I thought, well, is that a poem that I've written? Because it is quite good, although I don't like the person who wrote it. I thought, yeah, actually, he's a bit of a prick, but sort of he's quite a good poet. You've got to give him that, you know. But at the end of it, I thought, so is this a poem or not, or is this a fictional poem? But I found that I liked the second author much better, the Connor Davey author, because he seemed like a much less mannered writer who had more energy. But in the end of the day, it was just me making them all up anyway. But it was I just liked the way that you could leave the big plot twist or the denouement until the very last footnote. That you could, the last footnote will get the reader to actually revisit everything that they've read previously in the poem, and cast it in a different light, So, yeah, and also I'm a huge fan. Well, I'm really interested in a load of the beat writers. They were a questionable crew, but they really did something for literature. And yeah, when I was a teenager, I worshipped them, foolishly. And then you read some of the stories that I actually recounted in the footnote to American Light. And it's always distressing, but kind of liberating when you find out that people that you've worshipped perhaps weren't worthy of that worship, or perhaps deserved the exact opposite of that word. It's always distressing, because you have to. It changes the way that I think about their art. I know it shouldn't, but sort of, I used to say enjoy Salvador Dali's paintings much more before I found out that he was a mad fascist. Apparently so.
Oh, why?
Yeah.
Why is everyone a fascist these days?
I don't know. It was, well, I mean, he was an early adapter, Dali, sort of, he wasn't jumping onto any bandwagons. He was starting the bandwagon. I know I'm reading an interview with him in Andy Warhol magazine. An interview with Candy Darling, the Warhol starlet. And yes, he sounded bonkers and fascist. It was, but you know, it's you have to. I noticed that you said in the last letter that I got from you that you prefer to remember Rosemary's Baby as having directed itself, which is, I suppose, the same thing that I do with works of art or works of literature or films or whatever, that where I found out something distressing about the person who created them. It shouldn't make any difference, but it does. It puts a sort of filter over, no matter how much you might have once enjoyed Rolf Harris, sort of those days are gone forever,
But that kind of like complexity of humanity you've always put into your work as well. I think like your characters are always really complex people who are often do things that aren't that nice. You know what I mean? They're really layered, and I feel like I always think even people who you love, you really have to be able to appreciate what their faults are, because otherwise your feelings for them are kind of unreal. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
is
that's
that
true.
something?
And the same thing works the other way as well. Yes, people that you really love or characters that you really love, you have to be able to say, look, if these are going to be real characters, then they're going to have their own flaws and their own way of thinking that will lead to their actions and their behavior. But the same thing works the other way. If you've got characters that you really loathe and despise, I think it's more important to find something about them. Perhaps love is too strong a word, but to have some compassion for the character, no matter how vile they are, because you have to assume that sort of people who are vile for a reason. That has generally been my experience in life. That sort of the school bullies that years later you find out had a horrific home life, which doesn't excuse what they did, but it explains it. So I've always found that, yeah, you have to really get inside all of the characters, which means accepting that probably every possible human personality in the world is at least similar enough to your own for you to at least be able to imagine it. And then I think that perhaps all human personalities, I like to imagine them as a big, multifaceted sphere of which we only polish one facet, or a few facets to get us through our lives. But if I'm coming up with a character, I'll try to actually, I don't get all method on, sort of, I don't go out and murder Victorian prostitutes or anything like that. But I sort of, you try to put yourself into the character, which is it's a marvelous shape-shifting experience, because you can be any gender, you can be any race, you can be any species, you can be things that nobody has ever imagined before, and there's generally a way that you can think, all right, if I was a thing that had never been imagined before, how would I be feeling about this or that? And you can generally think up, well, I find that I can generally build up a character that at least I believe in. And if I believe in it, then I can probably write it so that everybody, well, most people will believe.
And I feel like that brings in like a much needed reality to, stories or situations or genres where often things are set apart from the real world. So for instance, when you don't have that kind of nuance or complexity in like a villain character, they're just 2D and they're just a monster. But the reality of the world is that people who do monstrous and villainous things aren't two-dimensional people, and they will have someone in their life that they love or something that they do that is good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, when I was back in the early 80s, I think, when I was doing the since disowned V for Vendetta, and I'd got to come up with the kind of Nazi apparatchiks running this kind of surveillance society. And I thought my impulse is to write them all as Nazi villains. I'm going to give them all monocles and a University of Heidelberg dueling scar. And I thought, but that's not true, is it? The Martians weren't monsters that arrived from Neptune. They were shopkeepers and ordinary people from all walks of life who, at a moment in their history, all decided that they'd give this fascism thing a try, or were herded into it, or for various reasons ended up badly on the wrong side of history. So I was thinking that would be the same in my future world of 1997, wouldn't it? In this impossible future date that in 1981 I'm obviously never going to get to, you know. So I tried to come up with all of the characters had got different reasons. Some of them were decent people who had just got kind of pressed by circumstance into an uncomfortable role. Some of them were horrible people who were taking advantage of the power that their new position gave them. It's if you start off just thinking, well, what would humans do? It's not a bad not a bad place to start from when you're coming up with a character, and yeah, have some compassion for everything that you're writing, even the inanimate objects if necessary. It's because unless you can have some compassion for a thing, you can't fully understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And unless you can fully understand it, you probably can't write about it particularly well. So or at least not to the level that you might be able to write about if you did understand it.
Speaking of writing about things you understand, we must, of course, come to what we can know about Thunderman, which is the novel-length short story in this collection. And I feel like I'm wondering if the story is it's about the greasy underbelly of the comics industry, let's say. And I'm wondering if this story kind of functions as a bit of an exorcism of your feelings.
Yeah, perhaps an exit or a purge at the very least. It's sort of, I mean, having quit comics in 2018 with the conclusion of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, that I found that, yeah, quitting comics is fine. I had no trouble with that at all. But stopping thinking about comics after you've been in that business for 40 years is easier said than done. And I found myself muttering angrily in my lush bath in the mornings. I'd be sitting there covered in glitter and absolutely furious. And I thought, and also I'd find odd memories of when I had enjoyed comics. When I was a kid, the first time I saw them, things like that. And I thought, what you should do is get all this into a story, although I made a couple of false starts that didn't really work. I think one of them I'd started in England because I thought, well, about English comics, but that didn't really work. It was a bit too depressing or something like that. But once I'd switched it to the American comic scene, which I also know, that really sort of seemed to give it a shape. And also, I was also, like I said a few minutes ago, that having read David Foster Wallace a few years ago, and I'd noticed that one of the things that he does, he likes to take an institution which he makes into a synecdoche. Is that the word?
Oh, I don't know.
I think it is. I think it's pronounced like that, or it's synecdoche, or something like that. I'm not sure. But he likes to take some institution and then make that stand in for the nation, or perhaps the whole world. And I thought, yeah, that could be a good way to do a story. But the only institution that I have any knowledge of is the comics industry. And I thought, but that could work. So yeah, it was like lancing a boil in some ways. Better out than in, certainly. And I just thought, yeah, I'm just going to write this story, no matter where it takes me, as long as it feels emotionally true. And a lot of it is actually literally true, horrifically. But yeah, and I've stopped muttering in the bath. So result,
I think that sound we can all hear is your lawyer somewhere screaming in a in a living room or saying, no, it's based on real events.
Based on real events, yes, of course. Yes, none of it was literally true, but based upon real events, closely based upon real events.
I mean, it's a really fun read, not least because we know that you're writing it and that you will have put so many of your feelings into it. But it also, it kind of, for me at least, it is about comics, and it is about the comics industry. But more than that, it's about the kind of dehumanizing nature of capitalism, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, and well, it's about and the dehumanizing nature of capitalism, and specifically in this instance, the dehumanizing nature of comics. This is comics just seem to me to have become, over this last 10, 15 years, it's all changed, because it's now probably actually since I messed with it back in the 80s, and there were all those headlines saying Bam Sock Pal comics have grown up, when in fact they hadn't. They'd met the emotional age of the audience coming the other way. And this is not to say that this is true of everybody, but when the audience for comics doesn't contain hardly any young people anymore, when they're all hobbyists in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, it's fine to have a hobby. That's fine, whatever it is. But I was, this would have been probably over 10 years, perhaps exactly 10 years ago, when I was doing some publicity for the Fashion Beast book that I did with Malcolm McLaren. And there was a reporter from one of the papers, probably The Guardian, who had sort of, because they knew I didn't want to talk about superhero films, had done a very contrived question to get me to talk about superhero films. So I thought, okay, well, if they've asked me, I can go into a rant. So I went into a rant, and I was explaining that what I objected to was the thought that hundreds of thousands of people, allegedly adult people, were going to see Batman movies. We're going to see characters that had been invented to entertain the 12-year-old boys of 50, 60, 70, 80 years before. And I also said that I thought that this was dangerous politically, that because this would, it spoke to me of a kind of an infantilization of the audience. And comic book narratives, they're always resolved by violence. I mean, sort of conflict resolution in a superhero comic, it's only going to go one way. They've all got a simplistic black and white view of reality, of white hats and black hats, let's say. And they apparently have no idea of how actual reality works. If you've only read superhero comics, you won't have. Everything will have an explanation in another dimension. And I've become, since 2016, I've become increasingly alarmed at the massive right wing push that happened then. And since the year that we voted to leave the EU and Donald Trump was elected in America, I think 6 of the top 12 movies were all superhero films.
Wow.
And I noticed that in Donald Trump's early campaign, he was, for one thing, his supporters were all calling him the Donald, as if that was his secret identity. And that Kellyanne Conway was dressed up as Supergirl at the inaugural ball. What was it? Anthony Scaramucci, who existed for about 10 days.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I saw a picture in one of the supplements of him posing in a Superman flying pose in front of loads of Superman memorabilia. And I thought, I think I can see where this is going, and then, the rest of history happened and proved me completely right, as usual. So, yeah, it's about superheroes go very well with capitalism. And this is specifically superheroes that I'm talking about here. Because, I mean, the comics medium is still something that I love as much as ever, but it's the way that superheroes are a kind of spandex kudzu that has just spread over the entire landscape. And when you see things like the QAnon conspiracy theories about sort of underground subterranean demons and paedophile Democrats in a conspiracy to harvest the adrenochrome of children, which I think was invented by Hunter S. Thompson in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. This is a comic book plot and not a particularly good one. And seeing how the last 5 or 6 years of our history have gone, if I was an editor, I would have called the writer in, because this is pretty much narrative collapse. It's sort of someone should have had a word. So, yes, it is about capitalism, but through that particular distorted lens of the comics industry, which makes it all so. The things that happen in comics they happen in every industry.
Mm-hmm.
But comics, it's worse because comics, they're selling themselves to a juvenile audience of where this is all huge fun and it's kind of childish. And to have people doing horrible adult things in that world, and by adult things, I mean, robbing each other, embezzling or extorting, sort of, that somehow seems worse, perhaps because of its context,
Mm-hmm. I feel like we could have like a 2-hour event about the inherently fascist nature of superhero movies now, but we should move on because I know people have questions. But I wanted to ask you specifically, Alan, because we were chatting before the event started, and we mentioned how on your 40th birthday, you very famously declared yourself and became a ceremonial magician. And I love the way you talk about magic and art and writing being the same thing, and the power therein, and the application of this in our lives and this kind of stuff. And not to give your age away, Alan, but you've now had 3 decades of being a ceremonial magician, 3 decades in one day. And I'm wondering if your kind of engagement with it or your belief system around it has changed in those 30 years at all.
It's, I think, become more sophisticated. I don't really do much of the ceremonial bit these days. That was probably when I started out as a magician and needed to convince myself that this wasn't all delusional, that it did have a kind of practical application in the real world. And I needed things to convince me. These days, I am convinced of magic, and it's a worldview that I have internalized and which affects pretty much everything that I do. So no, it's got more acute, but I still hold with almost everything that I said back in my frankly delusional first couple of years of magic, especially the thing about the equivalence between magic and art. I mean, these days, I'd say that representation, i.e., art, and consciousness, and writing, and magic probably are all part of the same thing and all arose at the same time. So I believe that, yes, any artistic expression potentially is an act of magic. You're using your consciousness in a purposeful way to have an effect that is kind of beyond the frontiers of science to explain. You're trying to affect other people's minds and their reality and the way that they see the world, which is a big thing. You're trying to conjure things into being, into tangible and visible being for your readership. And also, I remember always that back in the bardic tradition of magic, if you offended a magician, they might put a curse on you and your hens might lay funny for 6 months. If you offended a bard, they might put a satire on you, which would make you ridiculous in the eyes of your contemporaries, in the eyes probably of your family, of yourself, and that would probably endure. If it was a good satire, people after you were dead would still be laughing at you. This is why people were terrified of bards, much more than they were terrified of warlocks or witches. And this is what I would like to see. I would like to see people terrified of writers. That would be very impactful. Well, not terrified, but I would like to see writers themselves actually thinking of themselves as something more than entertainers. I would like to see writers and artists and musicians and everybody thinking of what they actually are, not what they've been corralled into being, into part of an entertainment system. I think that people probably put limits upon themselves. One of the things that becoming a magician did for me was to remove those limits. So, I mean, if you're going to declare yourself as a magician when you're really, really drunk and celebrating your birthday in a biker's pub, then hell, you can really pretty much write your own rule book after that. Because the power of declaring something and sticking to it is also large, and we end up being what we pretend to be. I mean, I think that's probably true of most of us. We kind of invent a personality for ourselves when we're about 12 or 13, when we realise that the personality that got us through our first 12 or 13 years of life isn't going to work when it comes to our puberty and adolescence. So we start to borrow bits from fictional characters, from friends that we admire, and we put together this Frankenstein personality, which after a few years, we forget that we put it together and we assume that it's us. You know, we probably stay with that for our entire lives. You know, it's so yeah, accepting a different level of possibilities or different parameters upon my reality has changed the way that I think about things and the way that I do things. And I'm constantly working to improve it. To if I just increase the, I don't know, the rhythm of this sentence, could I completely mesmerize somebody? You know, I remember William Burroughs once saying that the perfect writer should be able to write about the experience of death so perfectly that all of their readers would die. Now, that isn't a really financially viable plan for a writer. But I liked the sentiment there. I don't want to kill anybody, but I like the idea of being able to almost physically involve people in whatever they're reading, you know? And I think that writers can do that, and I think that magicians can do that.
I've got so many thoughts in my head now about revulsion and writing about disgust and things, but I'm not going to go down that one because, again, we have a limited amount of time.
We'll save that for a letter, Heather.
We'll save that for an email. I do have a very neat, I can segue perfectly into some audience questions now, Alan, because a question from Simon, I think, is a great follow-up to what you were just talking about. Simon says he's looking forward to the publication of the Moon and Serpent bumper book of magic. And he asks, what role do you see magic having in the ongoing fight against fascism and the overthrowing of capitalism?
Well, I think that the whole point of magic is not to acquire physical results. I think that, or everybody would be doing sigils to end fascism forever. No, you change your consciousness. That's the important thing. That's all that you have power over. That's all you can do, to change your own consciousness. And if you can do that, then you make yourself into the kind of person that could end fascism forever. Can I brag here a little bit?
Please do. Please do.
I think about how many years? 20 in the November, exactly a year ago. Exactly a year ago, my daughter sent me a letter that she'd had from a Brazilian journalist, saying that the elections were just coming up, and it was Bolsonaro against Lula da Silva. Bolsonaro was a complete fascist who was on his way to completely destroying the Amazon, and displacing all these indigenous people and everything like that. And this journalist was saying that I do have apparently quite a big following in Brazil. And would I write a letter explaining why everybody should vote for Lula rather than Bolsonaro? So end fascism in Brazil forever. You've got 5 days. And I stayed up really, really late one night and I wrote this letter that started, "Dearest Brazil," and I really wrote my heart out. It was, I was a bit tired by the time I'd finished, but it was some good writing. And apparently he sent it to Da Silva, and Da Silva posted it to the electorate of Brazil, and got in by a very, very narrow margin. So now I know that that wasn't necessarily because of the letter that I wrote, but I'm definitely going to claim it. And yeah, and if people would in future, I never had any academic letters after my name, but if they want to put sort of Saviour of Brazil in brackets, then that would suit me very well. You know, so yes, you can actually have an effect just because you've altered your own consciousness, and you know, that's the way to do it, and that is the way that magic could still affect huge changes in the culture that we've been saddled with.
And you two could end up saving Brazil as well, or
Could end up saving Brazil, although I have pretty much got that covered. You know, I mean, I was talking with some friends the other day, and they were saying, we were talking about ways that capitalism could be dismantled and things like that, and then one of them said, yeah, well, I mean, there's still a problem with all this populist fascism. And I said, I think you can leave that to me. You can, everybody. Don't worry about it. I've got this.
This is a very, very different question. But now I've read it, I'm also curious, so I'm going to ask it. Stephen says he'd love to know if you're a fan of Star Trek. Seems to be one of the best franchises for progressive beliefs and resolving conflict through empathy.
Well, I can see that. I've never been a huge fan of Star Trek. I remember seeing the first series, and or the second series back in the old Kirk and Spock days, anyway. And there were some of the episodes had been written by science fiction writers that I quite admired, and they were really good. The rest of them looked a bit ropey to me because I was a teenager by then and was hypercritical of everything, you know. And after that, I kind of drifted away from television and movies to a degree. I didn't have a television set for years, and I still don't have a television signal. I've got a flat screen TV that I can watch DVDs on and box sets, but I've got it disconnected so that I don't actually have to receive any information from the world as it is, you know. But yeah, I think that things like Star Trek, that they can be good, they can be useful for moral instruction, you know, and this is probably all important. It probably all adds, you know, having a gay character in EastEnders. I never used to watch EastEnders, but it seemed to at least increase the level of debate. You know, so I should imagine. I think that anything that actually puts ethics into popular culture has got to be a good thing. You know, it's sort of whatever that program is, whether it's Star Trek or EastEnders. You know, but yes, I'd say that this is all valid. You know, anybody who is writing for a mass medium, they should be careful what they write about. Make sure that you're actually contributing something that is useful to culture rather than something which is potentially toxic, you know.
So the writers of EastEnders, be careful, is what we're saying. We've got a question from Rich. He says the improbably complex high energy state was my favorite story in Illuminations. You talk about imagining the impossible. How did you get yourself into the first femtosecond of reality?
Well, it was, first off, I learned the word femtosecond and thought, that's amazing. Although in the original draft, I think I'd got it as if femtosecond lasted as long as an ordinary second, then an ordinary second would last for 60 years, which I thought was pretty amazing. It turns out, no, it would last for something like 30 million years. femtoseconds are very, very small. And I thought, all right, so, and I'd heard about these thought experiments like the Boltzmann brains, which are just particles that have accidentally come together and by a fluke of statistics have formed a functioning brain that is somehow living and observing things. So I thought, well, that's a really stupid idea, although I believe it is still current in some areas of sort of scientific philosophy. But I thought, yeah, nice little brains with some sort of propulsion, and probably a sensor device that I fancy making it look like a quiff. And I can basically, I want to rehearse everything that will happen in once the universe has started, all of the things that will inevitably happen. I can have it all play out with these brains with quiffs. And so I was massively enjoying doing all that. Once I got into okay, so you're the first brain that's created, you're naturally going to assume that you're God. And also, when you find that there are other brains, you would have to convince them that you were God as well, because you wouldn't want any insurrections or anything like that. And I said, this is great, because actually, the improbably complex high energy state, it's also, it's a love story. It's just what goes wrong in the relationship between the Pamperall and Glyn. Yeah, it's got everything in there. I found to race through pretty much all of human behaviour in a femtosecond, I think, is probably one of my greatest literary achievements. You know, and it was, again, as with any kind of thinking your way into something, it was just, well, what would I probably do in those circumstances, or what would a version of me probably do in those circumstances? And then it all kind of follows on from there, really. You know,
I feel like that's such a good advert for the book. Like, if people haven't read it, you must buy it for this content, guys. We've got quite a couple of people actually asking what you have been reading lately, and if you've been reading anything interesting.
well, this is going to sound incredibly sort of set up, but I've of course been reading your work, Heather, and finding it completely amazing. And also, I've been reading those South American women authors that you recommended, and they were an absolute revelation. You know, this week,
Samantha Schweblin, Fernanda
Matthew
Trias,
Sedley
and
and
Ariana Harwich.
Ariana Harwich. Yeah, it's sort of because I'd reached a point where I'd got kind of sick of horror, because I thought, actually, what's the point? We're surrounded by horror. What's the point in inventing new horror? And then I read that Mariana Rodriguez. Enriquez, sorry. Yeah. Mariana Enriquez, Our Share of the Dark.
Our Share of Night.
Our Share of the Night. Yeah. And sort of, obviously, I didn't read the cover very closely, but the rest of the book was wonderful, because she was using it to talk about the disappeared in Argentina. And I found that in your Orpheus Builds a Girl, that you were using it to talk about something that is real. You were using the vocabulary of horror to talk about something that's real. And yeah, with all of the authors that I've mentioned, it's beautiful language and beautiful prose as well. You know, what else have I been reading? Just trying to think. I read a really, really interesting book. And again, I've probably forgotten the title and the author, but it was a book. It might have been called Last Picture Shows. and it was somebody who'd done a book full of the last films that various people saw, including Charlie Chaplin, John Dillinger, and it's. I didn't think that it would be as revealing as it was, but sort of there's a real poetry in it. These films that just happen, because obviously nobody plans their last film.
Mm.
You know, it's these are just things that happened. But that was a really, really good book, and I'm very sorry that I can't remember the title of the author. It was something like Last Picture. I was reading an advanced copy, so watch for something like that coming out in the next few months, I guess. So that pretty much, and oh yeah, and loads of research for my Long London series as well, which has been immense fun.
This brings us perfectly into what I think will probably be our last question, because we've got 5 minutes left. But that does give us a little bit of time to talk about Long London. Stephen says, do you plan for Long London for the whole series to be as experimental as your other prose? And maybe for those people who've not heard of it yet, you can just give us a little intro to the series.
Well, to answer Stephen, I'm probably not going to be. It's kind of experimental with the prose to a certain degree, but probably not as experimental as my other stuff. I'm loading all the experiment into the actual narrative rather than into the mechanics of the narrative. That said, there are some nice little touches and special effects in there, you know. But basically, what Long London, I'm trying to make it very accessible. This is me as a commercial writer with a 6-book contract. So I feel that it would be, if I did something that was impenetrable, that wouldn't serve me or the audience or the publishers particularly well. So I really want to make this as accessible as possible. It's a story about another London that coexists with the one that we know, which is kind of the symbolic layer of reality. It's things that happen on the symbol layer will play out in our world, but they start as symbols. The world of our imagination is clearly the world that actually underlies this physical world. It's where this physical world came from. And so we've got this hapless character who in the first book is 18. In the second book, he's 28, and so on. They happen at sort of roughly decade intervals up until 1979, when there's a 20-year gap, and then the last book is set in 1999 on Millennium Eve, more or less. The working title of the last book, at least at the moment, is And No River of Fire. But I'm trying to talk about a lot of things in it. I've got characters who can be used to represent certain strands of culture. In the first book, I've got the recent arrival of the Windrush, and also a character, Ras Prince Monolulu, who was a racing tipster who arrived here in the very early 20th century, and was a self-invented African. He actually came from St. Croix in the Danish West Indies, but he invented himself as an Abyssinian prince with a really unlikely history and a fantastic sense of dress. And he was playing to the white imagination. He came up with this cartoon African that really played upon all those colonial concepts and people loved him. So I've got him. representing the black experience in Britain in the first book. In the second book, Michael de Freitas turns up, who was Michael X, a 60s radical who before that had been an enforcer for Peter Rackman, the slum landlord in Notting Hill, who was also the cause of one of the causes of the Notting Hill riots of 1958, which was the first race riots in England. So that's something we'll be talking about in the second book. We've got queer characters, so that we can actually show the evolution of that, and queer identity. We've got hopefully more women characters starting with the second book. It was a bit light on the first book, just because of the way it seemed to work itself out. Although my daughter, and she is biased, of course, but she was saying that the personality of Coffin Ada was probably enough for 3 woman characters. So sort of, but yeah, I just want to take all and sort of aspects like, say, Europe, the British attitude to Europe, how that has changed, and the British attitude to nuclear weapons, and politics, and all of these strands that actually make up London and, by extension, the wider world. I want to follow these through 50 or 60 years of history and see what happens. And all the time with this this other world, the symbolic world that underlies this one, you know. So those are my hopes for the series, but you'll have to judge for yourselves when it's out.
If I'm allowed to say, I have already read the first one and you have achieved it and surpassed it.
Thank you
And
so much, Heather. Thank
honestly,
you.
it's so rich and layered, but also it's just so fun to read, like from the very first page.
Well, that was, yeah, I want to have fun with everything I'm doing, even all the really big depressing things. I am having a certain amount of fun with them, even if it's just kind of unintelligible writer's fun. But with the Long London things, it is actually kind of quite funny, a lot of it. There's probably at least as much in there that's funny as there is that's horrific. And I really like squashing them all up together, because that is my experience of life.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of it's horror and comedy and tragedy and everything all at once. You know, it's not divided into genres. You know, so that's what I'm trying for with Long London, something that is outside genre. Although, yeah, you could say it's kind of occult, noir, low life, crime fiction, social history, or something. But yeah, I'm pleased with it so far.
And remind us, is that 2025 that's coming out?
That I think will be out in 2025, or is it 2024? It might be 2024. I'm not sure about lead times in the publishing industry. In the comics, it was always a month or a week. You know? But these days it's different. But I think, yeah, 2024 or 2025. Not sure.
I'm almost certain you can pre-order it already, and you should. I highly recommend it. I also highly recommend getting Illuminations if you've not got it yet. And Alan, as you know, I could chat to you all evening. However, we're going to have to bring things to a close.
Oh, well.
I know. I've got my little closing spiel, which I'm going to say, which is that this Book Week Scotland event has been brought to you by the brilliant and wonderful Scottish Book Trust, who want everyone living in Scotland to have equal access to books, because better access to books means better life chances. You can help by gifting a book to a family who's struggling this Christmas. If you've enjoyed this event, please consider sharing your love of reading with others by making a donation to Scottish Book Trust Christmas Appeal at scottishbooktrust.com. Thank you also to funders Creative Scotland. And if you enjoyed this event, please let us know by filling out the evaluation linked in the chat. I'm sure someone's dropping that in right now in a very technical way. Alan, it has been a pure joy to chat to you. And thank you so much for being here with us and all the work you've always given us.
Well, it's been just as lovely talking to you, Heather. And so it's been a fantastic sort of afternoon to spend as a septuagenarian. And sort of if the rest of the decade is like this, I should be well satisfied.
What a beautiful note to end on. On that note, we'll say thank you to everyone who's joined us today.
Okay, thanks everybody. Take care. Bye-bye. Ah, well, I think that's it. Is it?
I think we're out.
Are we out?